Trump didn't just threaten Canada today, he gave Mark Carney a deadline. And when a sitting American president draws a line in the sand against the country that shares the longest undefended border in human history, you are no longer watching politics. You are watching the opening scene of something this generation has never seen before. Stop what you are doing, because what happened in the last hour is not a tweet. It is not a press conference gaffe. It is not a negotiating bluff dressed up in presidential language. What Donald Trump said today about Canada, about Mark Carney, about the sovereign nation that sits on America's northern border, the nation that has stood beside the United States in every war, every crisis, every moment of civilizational reckoning for the last 2 centuries, is something that political historians will be writing about for decades. And most of the people watching the news right now do not understand the full weight of what just dropped. But you are about to. If you have ever wondered what it looks like when a superpower turns on its closest friend, you are watching it in real time. If you have ever wondered what it feels like when the rules that governed an entire continent for over 200 years get shredded in a single afternoon, today is the day you find out. The world you woke up in this morning is gone, and the one replacing it is colder, more dangerous, and more unpredictable than anything North America has faced since the Cuban Missile Crisis pointed Soviet warheads 90 miles off the Florida coast. Here is what you need to understand before we go any further. The relationship between the United States and Canada is not just a diplomatic relationship. It is not just a trade relationship. It is the most deeply integrated bilateral partnership in the history of the modern world. 2 countries, 1 economy, 1 defense perimeter, 1 shared electrical grid in places, 1 shared water system, 1 border so open, so trusted, so historically peaceful, that it earned the title of the longest undefended border on Earth. 5,525 miles of land, where 2 nations decided generations ago that they did not need guns pointed at each other to feel safe. That decision was not just a policy, it was a philosophy. It was a declaration to the rest of the world that 2 democracies, 2 free peoples could share a continent without domination, without coercion, without one telling the other to obey. Donald Trump just torched that philosophy today, and he did it publicly, and he did it with a smile. To understand what just happened, you have to understand the world that existed before today. You have to understand the assumption, the deep bedrock foundational assumption that every Canadian Prime Minister, every American president, every NATO general, every Wall Street banker, and every farmer on both sides of that border has operated under for generations. That assumption was simple. The United States and Canada are partners, not master and subject. They negotiate, they disagree, they impose tariffs, they argue about softwood lumber, they fight about dairy quotas and auto parts and pharmaceutical pricing, but they do it as equals, and at the end of every dispute, both nations walk away with their sovereignty intact. That was the rule, that was the understanding, that was the invisible contract written not in law, but in the shared memory of 2 peoples who chose cooperation over conquest. Trump did not just challenge that rule today, he declared it dead. He looked at Canada's newly elected Prime Minister, and he said in language that left no room for interpretation that Canada must obey, not negotiate, not compromise, obey. And behind that word, that single loaded, historically catastrophic word, was the shadow of military force. Now let's talk about the players, because this story is not just about policy. It is about 2 men, 2 visions of power, and 1 continent that is caught between them. Donald Trump is 78 years old, and he has spent the last 4 years in political exile, dreaming of this moment. He came back to the White House in January 2025, not as a man seeking redemption. He came back as a man seeking dominance. The first Trump term, for all its chaos, still operated within certain guardrails. Advisors who pushed back, institutions that resisted, norms that bent but did not fully break. This second term is different. The guardrails are gone. The advisors who remain are loyalists, not skeptics. The institutions have been weakened by 4 years of assault and 1 landslide election result that Trump has interpreted not as a political victory, but as a personal mandate from God and the American people to do whatever he believes is necessary. Trump in 2025 is not the Trump of 2017. He is more confident, more isolated, more ideologically pure, and more dangerous to the international order than at any previous moment in his political life. And what does Trump believe? He believes with the absolute conviction of a man who has never been successfully held accountable for anything that America has been ripped off by China, by Europe, by Mexico, and yes, by Canada. Believes that the trade relationships, the alliances, the international agreements that defined the post-World War II order were deals made by weak American leaders who sacrificed American workers on the altar of global cooperation. He believes that the only language the world respects is strength, and he has decided that Canada, quiet, polite, hockey-playing, peacekeeping Canada, is going to be the country that proves his point. Now meet the man on the other side of this confrontation, Mark Carney. If Donald Trump is a political creature born from the rage of the American heartland, Mark Carney is something almost entirely opposite. Carney is a technocrat of the highest order, a man who ran the Bank of Canada during the 2008 financial crisis, then ran the Bank of England through Brexit, one of the most economically turbulent events in modern British history. He is calm where Trump is volcanic. He is precise where Trump is scattered. He is deeply, almost surgically rational in a moment that demands a rational mind. Carney became the leader of the Liberal Party of Canada in early 2025, replacing Justin Trudeau after Trudeau's political collapse, and he won the subsequent federal election on a platform that was in large part built around standing up to Donald Trump. The Canadian people did not elect Mark Carney despite his promise to resist American pressure. They elected him because of it. So you have a president who demands obedience, and you have a prime minister whose entire electoral mandate is built on refusing to give it. This was always going to explode. The only question was when and how loudly. Here is what happened today, step by step, piece by piece, the way it actually unfolded. Trump had been escalating his rhetoric about Canada for weeks. Since returning to office, he had reimposed and expanded tariffs on Canadian goods, steel, aluminum, auto parts, lumber, agricultural products at levels that economists described as punishing and that Canadian industry described as existential. He had revived his suggestion, which he first floated casually and then began repeating with increasing seriousness, that Canada should become the 51st state of the United States. Most analysts initially dismissed this as Trumpian bluster, the kind of provocative hypothetical he floats to dominate a new cycle and watch the world react. But something shifted in the last several weeks. The tone changed, the framing changed. Trump stopped presenting the 51st state idea as a joke or a thought experiment. He started presenting it as an inevitability, as something that would be better for everyone if Canada simply accepted it. And then today, the language escalated to a place it has never gone before. Trump, in remarks that sent shockwaves through Ottawa, through NATO headquarters in Brussels, through every allied capital in the Western world, directly threatened Canada with consequences that went beyond economic pressure. He told Mark Carney publicly that the Canadian Prime Minister needed to understand who he was dealing with. He referenced American military and economic power in the same breath that he referenced Canada's future. He made clear, and these are not paraphrased, these are the reported characterizations coming out of multiple news organizations covering the remarks that the United States had options beyond tariffs if Canada continued to resist American demands. He said Carney needed to obey. That word obey did not appear in a background briefing. It did not appear in a leaked memo. It appeared in Trump's public remarks directed at the head of government of a sovereign allied nation. Let that land for a moment. The President of the United States told the Prime Minister of Canada to obey him, not to cooperate, not to come to the table, not to reconsider his position, to obey. Carney's response was immediate, and it was not soft. The Canadian Prime Minister, who spent years navigating the most powerful financial institutions in the Western world, who has sat across tables from central bankers, heads of state, and crisis negotiators on multiple continents, did not flinch. He said Canada is not for sale. He said Canada will not be bullied. He said the Canadian people chose sovereignty, and sovereignty is what their government will protect. And then in a line that will define his political career for as long as it lasts, he said that Canada has friends all over the world, and it will not be without options. That last sentence is more important than it sounds, because Mark Carney is not a man who uses words carelessly. When a former central banker, a man who spent his career speaking in measured, precise, globally consequential language, tells you that his country will not be without options, he is not speaking rhetorically. He is sending a signal to Beijing, to Brussels, to New Delhi, to every capital on earth that has been watching the United States dismantle its own alliances and wondering who will fill the vacuum. Now follow the money, because this is where the story stops being about two men and starts being about you. Canada is the single largest export market for the United States, not Mexico, not China, not the entire European Union. Canada, in 2024, bilateral trade between the two countries exceeded $700 billion. Nearly 2 million American jobs depend directly on trade with Canada. The energy sector alone, Canadian oil flowing through pipelines into American refineries powering American cars, heating American homes, is so deeply integrated that economists have described the North American energy relationship as a single system with an international border drawn through the middle. If that relationship fractures, if Canada begins rerouting its energy exports, if it begins redirecting its trade toward Europe and Asia and China, if it begins building the kind of parallel economic architecture that a nation builds when it has decided its southern neighbor cannot be trusted, the costs to ordinary Americans will not be abstract. They will show up in gas prices. They will show up in grocery bills. They will show up in manufacturing layoffs in Michigan and Ohio and Pennsylvania, in the very states that gave Trump his second term on the promise that he would make their economic lives better. The people who will pay for this confrontation are not the people in the room where it is happening. They're the people watching this video right now. They are the auto worker in Windsor, Ontario, and the auto worker in Detroit, Michigan, who both depend on the same integrated supply chain that Trump is now threatening to shatter. They are the farmers on both sides of the border who sell to each other, buy from each other, and have built entire business models on the assumption of frictionless trade. When a president plays chicken with $700 billion in trade, ordinary people do not get to sit in the passenger seat. They get to stand on the road and watch the cars coming. But here is where the story gets darker, because there is a deeper truth underneath all of this that the headlines are not capturing. What Trump is doing to Canada is not really about Canada. Canada is the test case. Canada is the proof of concept. Canada is the country Trump chose to demonstrate to the entire world that the United States, under his leadership, will use its power, economic, political, military, and implication, if not in fact, to bring its neighbors and its allies into line. If he can make Canada obey, the message to every other nation on earth is deafening. If Canada, wealthy, democratic, English-speaking, deeply American integrated Canada, can be brought to its knees and told to comply or face consequences, then what chance does anyone else have? What chance does a small Southeast Asian nation have? What chance does a Central American country have? What chance does a NATO ally in Eastern Europe have if the United States decides that alliance commitments are now conditional on ideological and economic compliance? This is the doctrine of dominance, replacing the doctrine of partnership. And once that replacement is complete, the world that existed since 1945, the world of international law, collective security, multilateral trade, agreements, and the peaceful resolution of disputes, does not come back quietly. It is replaced by something that history has a very clear name for: empire. The United States was founded on a rejection of empire. The entire American founding mythology is built on the story of a people who refused to be dominated by a distant power that taxed them without representation, that dictated their commerce, that told them to obey. And now, in the 21st century, an American president is directing that same posture: dictate, demand, threaten, dominate at the country directly north of the Rio Grande. The irony is not subtle. The irony is the entire story, and Mark Carney knows this. He knows that he is not just fighting for a trade deal. He is fighting for the principle that nations, regardless of their size, regardless of their proximity to American power, have the right to choose their own path. He is fighting for the idea that alliance means partnership, not subordination, and he is fighting that fight at a moment when the world is watching, when China is watching, when Europe is watching, when every country that has ever wondered whether the United States is still the leader of the free world or something else entirely is watching very carefully to see what happens next. So what has happened next? Let's be honest about the scenarios because there are several of them and none of them are comfortable. In the best case scenario, this is maximum pressure diplomacy and it works. Or more accurately, it works on Trump's terms. Carney facing an economy under strain from the tariffs, facing a Canadian business community screaming for relief, facing polling numbers that begin to slip as Canadian households feel the squeeze, eventually returns to the negotiating table and agrees to terms that give Trump enough of a political win to declare victory. The tariffs ease, trade resumes at something approaching normally, the 51st state rhetoric fades back into background noise, both men claim they won, and the world sighs with nervous relief while quietly noting that the rules of engagement between nations have permanently shifted. This is the best case. And even in the best case, something irreplaceable has been lost. In the more likely scenario, neither man blinks quickly. Carney's mandate was built on resistance. His voters did not send him to Ottawa to capitulate to a man who told their country to obey. Trump's political brand is built on winning, and any deal that looks like he backed down is a deal he will not make. So the standoff continues. The tariffs stay. Canada retaliates with its own measures targeting American goods in states that voted for Trump, a strategy Canadian officials have explicitly discussed targeting bourbon from Kentucky, orange juice from Florida, agricultural products from the Midwest. The economic pain on both sides of the border grows, and Canada begins quietly but decisively to do what Carney signaled when he said Canada will not be without options. It begins diversifying. It deepens trade talks with the European Union. It accelerates conversations with India. It does the thing that Trump fears most but keeps forcing with every ultimatum. It starts building an economic architecture that does not depend on American cooperation in the worst-case scenario. And it is important to say clearly that this is not a certainty, but it is a possibility that serious analysts are no longer dismissing. The rhetoric about military force stops being rhetoric. Trump has surrounded himself with advisors and cabinet members who share his view that American power should be exercised without apology and without the restraints of international convention. The suggestion that the United States might use military or quasi-military pressure to bring Canada into compliance is not coming from nowhere. It is coming from a White House that has already shown it is willing to say things that previous administrations considered unsayable. And once you say unsayable things long enough without consequence, they stop being unsayable. They start being policy. A military conflict between the United States and Canada would not just be a catastrophe for both nations. It would be the end of the Western Alliance as it has existed since World War II. NATO does not survive the United States attacking a NATO member. The dollar's status as the world's reserve currency does not survive the kind of global realignment that would follow. American power, which is built not just on military force but on the consent and cooperation of dozens of allied nations, does not survive the demonstration that it will be turned against its own friends. The worst case is not just bad for Canada. The worst case is the end of the American century. You need to sit with that, not in panic, not in despair, but with the full weight of seriousness that this moment demands. Because here is the thing about moments like this one. They feel sudden. They feel like they came from nowhere, but they never do. This moment was built piece by piece over years of eroding norms of accepting behavior that would have disqualified any previous political figure of treating the institutions and alliances and agreements that keep the peace as optional, as negotiable, as inconveniences rather than necessities. Every time someone said Trump does not mean it, every time someone said he is just negotiating, every time someone normalized the abnormal and called it strategy, this moment grew a little closer. And now it is here. And the question is not whether you saw it coming. The question is what you do now that it has arrived. Canada did not ask for this fight. Canada woke up on the morning of the American election and watched its most important partner, its closest neighbor, its largest customer, its oldest ally, choose a man who had already spent 4 years treating Canadian sovereignty as an inconvenience. And then Canada held its own election and chose a man who looked at that reality and said, "We will not bend, we will not break, we will not obey." Whether that choice leads to a better outcome or a worse one depends entirely on what happens in the next 30 days. In the halls of power in Ottawa and Washington, in the offices of the companies that move billions of dollars across that border every single week, in the quiet conversations between foreign ministers and trade representatives and military officials who are all right now working through contingency plans they hoped they would never need. The longest undefended border in the world is still undefended tonight. The guns are still not pointed. The soldiers are still not masked. But something that was invisible and assumed and taken entirely for granted, the good faith between two nations that chose partnership over power, has been cracked. And cracked things, as any engineer will tell you, do not heal on their own. They either get repaired with care and intention, or they fracture completely under the next application of pressure. Trump is not done applying pressure. He has never been done applying pressure. That is who he is. That is the entire operating logic of his political identity. Escalate until you get what you want. And if you do not get what you want, escalate further. The question for Mark Carney, for Canada, for every American who is watching this unfold from the other side of a border they once never thought to question, is this: at what point does pressure become rupture? At what point does the threat become the action? At what point does the world that everyone assumed would always be there, stable, cooperative, governed by something resembling shared rules, admit that it is gone? That point may be closer than anyone is comfortable saying, out loud. And the fact that it is not being said loud enough in enough living rooms and enough town halls and enough comment sections and enough conversations between people who care about the direction of this country. That silence is part of the problem because history does not announce itself. It does not send a warning. It does not wait for you to be ready. It arrives in moments exactly like this one. A threat issued, a line crossed, a word spoken that cannot be taken back, and it demands that ordinary people decide whether they are paying attention or not. You are paying attention. That is why you are here. That is why you are still watching. So here is what I need you to do. I need you to ask yourself one question, and I need you to think about it seriously enough to put your answer in the comments below, because this conversation needs to happen, and it needs to happen now. If the United States under Donald Trump is willing to threaten Canada, Canada of all countries with the language of force in the demand of obedience, then what does that tell us about what America is becoming? And more importantly, what do we do about